Let's talk about the first tool in our lighting toolkit, and that is global illumination with HDRIs. That sounds like a bit of a mouthful, doesn't it? Global as in from everywhere. Illumination, make light, with HDRIs, high dynamic range images. That's what it stands for. Sometimes called global illumination, sometimes called HDRI lighting. It means the same thing. It means we're not setting lights that shine from points or from positions onto parts of our scene like we would do in a photographic studio. We would emulate the world, which basically creates lighting from everywhere. If you think about the sky, it doesn't just shine light from where the sun shines down. It also bounces light off from all around the atmosphere, and thereby creating a very soft light outside. Basically, there's no real darkness on one side of a character outside. They're being lit from everywhere, and that's because light not only comes from the atmosphere, but also bounces off from nearby buildings and stuff. And that's a very difficult thing to fake with lights in a studio, so therefore 3D engines have come up with this concept of global illumination. Instead of Daz Studio, let me take you into Unreal Engine, because I can demonstrate that concept very well. We're not going to talk really about Unreal Engine, just about the concept of the fact that in Unreal Engine I can go so far beyond the sky dome that you can actually see it with your own eyes, as if we're astronauts hovering around Earth and having a look at it. So here I have a scene that is set up like this. This is a HDRI that we're looking at, the whole background here that's provided by HDRI. And I have a character in the middle, much like I would have in Daz Studio. And I can move around it and I can look into different directions. And if I wouldn't know it's a HDRI, I really wouldn't know it. This might as well be geometry like the trees out there. But of course, it being a HDRI, it means that there's a lot less to calculate. If these all would be 3D objects, that would be really difficult for me to calculate. But if I go and select my whole sky dome now and zoom out, then you'll see this is actually what my scene looks like. So I do have more like a squashed sphere in my scene. I still see that grid here, just about. This is kind of the grid that we see in Daz Studio as well. And the sky dome, this is the sky dome, is essentially a sphere onto the inside of which is projected an image that with its light values shines light onto the inside of the scene from literally all angles, and thereby emulating what the sky does for us. In Unreal Engine, we have this thing called an envirodome. So it's not exactly a round sphere. It's kind of squashed out at the bottom so that we have the sensation of a ground here, of a ground plane. Notice though that by default, there isn't really a ground in there. This is just an invisible dome. And in Iray or Daz Studio, we have exactly the same concept. Depending on, let me go back to my character here, depending on how the HDRI has been photographed, there is an option to move the ground plane up or down. And in Unreal Engine, I can just go and show you this. Watch the tree line here. If I go and adjust the up and down value, then you can see this is actually what's happening. If I make that smaller, I can see more detail here now, but I can also see that my sky dome is kind of shrinking as I move this around in either direction. So there comes a point where this doesn't look natural, because now I'm basically putting the trees onto my ground here. That just doesn't look, that just looks wrong, doesn't it? So thankfully Iray can do this automatically. That's kind of cool. If I can also go wrong the other way, just wanted to show you, if you ever see phenomenons like this where you think the ground here is severely weirdly stretched, and I can also see that my environment just seems to dip somehow, then the position of the HDRI is obviously incorrect. Let me go back to the default setting and show you one other thing before we go back into Daz Studio and have a look at that. The shape of this envirodome here, this is actually, the default isn't quite correct, as I can see some of the trees are being sucked in here. So that's not exactly correct. This is probably correcter now. There. It's kind of nice that I can show you this here. Unreal Engine has this thing called the envirodome here. If I go and look at that in the browser, we have a couple of other options that we can use for that, and one of them is more like a box. So if I, instead of using this, I can go and left click and drag this into my environment dome mesh here, and then it becomes a box. And this is good if your HDRI isn't something that's been taken outdoors in a large environment, but more something in a smaller environment of something like a warehouse. So something like a smaller thing that actually has a cubic appearance, so it doesn't go and stretch out the corners, which are now much closer to the object. You might be able to see that. So Iray has these two options as well, a spheric and a cubic projection. And let's have a look at how it thinks about this and how we can bring in even our own images in a moment. Back into Daz Studio. This is my scene that currently comes with the default HDRI that we've talked about in a moment. And I've got my blue sphere here. That's my colleague here, my friend and partner in crime. If I head over to the render settings tab, I already have this environment option here. Just as I said last time, if you don't have this, switch your viewport over to NVIDIA Iray. And I might as well show you. Let me just go and delete this out of here. I don't have the environment option here at the moment either. I can either go and bring this in manually by hitting create new environment options node. Then I get an additional node in my scene tab, and that also means these options show up here. Or I can just go and switch my viewport over to Iray briefly, and then one is created for me, and that means my environments tab is here now. So we need that in order to play with the HDRI and see what is currently available there. So if I head over that, then I can see that here under the environment tab, I've got something that is provided for me by the friendly people from Daz, and it's called the Ruins HDRI. It's a really small image, and its only purpose is to give us some diffuse light. If I go over here to draw dome, then my dome is being drawn, and it looks just as washed out and small as my preview looked like. It's an out of focus picture, and it really is only here so that we can see the light. And you can see that hotspot here, that if I go and turn my sphere around, I should see this, which is this bright spot in the sky that is providing the main light source. But there's light really coming from all sides, and that is exactly what I see. As I go around my sphere, no side of the sphere is black. There's something else that I wanted to show you with this default before we move on to other things. If I switch this over to Iray, it'll take a second to calculate it. We see essentially the same stuff in the background, namely this out of focus image, but we can also see at the bottom that Iray is drawing me a shadow here, and that is kind of neat. So this is a really difficult concept. The HDRI on an environment dome isn't complete without something called a shadow catcher at the bottom to make realism believable. So without this, we can switch this off, and I'll show you how to do this, but without this, I would have a hard time believing that my 3D object really stands in a HDRI scene, which is how HDRIs are often used. If I don't want to see my background, I can just go disable that, and then all this that is now gray will be rendered in transparency in Iray, and that's kind of cool, but the shadows are still going to be rendered. So if you've ever tried to set up a shadow catcher manually in 3Delight or in other render engines, you know it's a bit of a problem. So I'm really glad that Iray provides that here for us. If I don't want that, if I want to go and draw in my own shadow, it's here under draw ground. That is also, if you want to whittle this down here, environment, there's dome, and then there's ground here, just so that we see a little bit less options here. There's this option here, draw ground. If I disable that, then my ground will not be drawn, and hence my shadow is also not going to be drawn. Here, this is what it looks like. A lot less believable. And if I draw this, if I let Iray create the shadow, then you can also see that the shadow is following how soft or harsh the shadows are in the original image. So mine were obviously very soft here. But watch what happens. Sadly, we can't preview this in Filament, so Filament doesn't draw shadows. It does draw the dome, so that's kind of neat. But watch what happens as we bring in our own HDRI from a site like Polyhaven, for example. That's the old HDRI Haven. I think that still resolves there, HDRI Haven. That now resolves to Polyhaven. That's a free resource for HDRI images and all kinds of other cool stuff like textures and models. Check it out. And under assets over here, HDRIs, you can browse a wide variety of free HDRI images that you can use. And let's just pick one of the many that are out here. How about this parking? Let's do that. You pick one, you can go, and they have all kinds of stuff here. So I highly recommend you explore this site and see how you can use these to take your art to the next level. You get a preview. This is what the HDRI really looks like. So a little bit stretched out. It's usually taken either with photogrammetry, like stitching together multiple pictures from multiple angles, or something like a light probe can take that. It's kind of weird things of how that can happen. On the top here, we have a choice of format, HDR or EXR. Daz Studio understands both formats, but other programs might not. So like Unreal Engine doesn't like EXRs, it only likes HDRs. Here you can set a resolution. 1K is a bit small, but it's good if you just want to use it for lighting. And then you can go up to, my goodness, 19K. That's crazy. Let's go stick with 8K. That's already 100 megabytes. So that's fairly high res. I'm going to click download and just go and save that file into my downloads folder. And then we're going to go and bring it into Daz Studio and see what this looks like inside Daz Studio and my blue sphere. All right, it's finished downloading. Let me head over here under environment, under dome. I will go and just click this little icon here. That is Daz Studio's way of saying, hey, there's something in here that's a texture. So on the surfaces tab, we find that. I can either say none, and then there's nothing in here, and it just says choose map. And in which case it'll have this little triangle icon here. When you click that, you can go either pick something that's already in your scene, or you head over to browse, and then pick the image that you'd like to load. In our case, it's this one here, parking. Open that. And it'll take a second for it to process now. So it's not going to, the effect isn't going to be available immediately. There's usually a little orange bar at the bottom of Daz Studio that says I'm processing this. So if it's a large file, just go on through and processes it. If I head over to enable my dome, I can already see that the light effect has changed. Let me go enable that, and boom! My goodness, we have a park that we can look at now. And my camera perspective isn't quite correct. So this is, I need to have a much wider lens than I currently have. And remember how to do this in the viewport? That was right clicking on that little loop icon here. If you hover over these icons, it also reminds you of what that is. So left clicking and dragging was dollying. I don't want to do that. I want to right click and drag, and therefore change the perspective of my scene. So I'm going to go way back, and then, not too far. That's a bit too much. But if I go to something like this, I can now go and see what that HDRI looks like. And look also how interesting, if I go and just go slightly further, closer to my sphere here, look at how interesting the sphere behaves as I put it into or out of lighting. The perspective is a little bit weird if you're not used to it, because it doesn't behave like geometry. If you're used to these things actually being 3D objects, it just doesn't behave that way. If you look at the ground, it behaves weirdly, but the illusion is going to be perfect the moment we have that shadow in there. So watch what happens if I move my sphere over to the shadow. It looks believably as if it's a shadowy object, and if I go and move it into the bright sunshine, it looks almost like it integrates here as well. But that's just filament. So if we switch this over to Iray, that's really when the real magic happens, because these settings, filament will follow them, but they're really designed for Iray. So if I do this, then it really looks like, hey, there's a blue sphere in this parking lot or whatever. And the shadow just makes this illusion complete. If I go over and compare this to the other shadows in the picture, watch what happens. It literally integrates there as if it needs to be there, as if it completely belongs there. If you zoom in and out, your background isn't going to change, just the size of your actual geometry. You can see the grid in the background here changing as I do this, but the HDRI is not changing. But you frame this up with a bit of trickery, and you have a perfectly believable solution there, as if a 3D character really integrates into this HDRI image. Look at the shadows. I mean, they kind of match one another. If I had a HDRI with softer shadows, then my shadows would also appear softer. But this looks believable, which is kind of cool. But if I didn't want to see the dome, I could just go and disable it, and then I could just use that HDRI even at a lower resolution just for lighting purposes. And then I can put my own trees around it. And I can see that the scene is actually reflecting in here. If you look really closely, you can see that all these trees that we've just looked at are now part of the scene. That is kind of cool. With or without the background, there's things that we can adjust here. One thing that you're going to find yourself adjusting a lot is the intensity of your HDRI, how strong is it that's shining onto my object. And this is really where switching off the dome comes in handy. That's here under environment intensity. There's two options actually. There's intensity that just goes from 1 to 0 and also further higher up. So if I go and wanted to increase that to 5, then I can now see that it's all completely blown out and it doesn't really look healthy. But once again, it depends on the HDRI that you have. And you can also make it less than 1. So let's say you can use the slider, you can use 0.5, for example. If you do that, then the HDRI itself gets darker, 0.2, and then at 0 there'll be no HDRI left. So if I type in 0, then we have a completely black picture, like I would expect. The other option is here under environment map. That is set to 2 by default. That is also a way of adjusting the intensity. It's essentially how opaque the environment texture is that you're using. So you could just use that. You could set that to 1 here, and then it would be as if you had left this at 2 and setting this to 0.5. I hope this makes sense. 2 ways of adjusting the intensity there. You can also give the environment a tint. If you want this whole thing to be a little bit, I don't know, a little bit pinker, then you can do that. Light changes are very strong, so you want to do this and only give it a tint really. So you're looking at the bottom row of this here. So if you wanted to make the whole image maybe a little bit redder, give it a little red cast, and this is enough to make it a bit warmer on that day. I'm going to go set this back to white. If you think back to the environment dome that I've shown you in Unreal Engine, it's the same idea here in Iray. So the default is a sphere. That's what we set up here at the top, an infinite sphere. That means we can't change the size of the sphere. It's infinite. We'll never be able to reach the bounds of that. I don't think you can anyway in Iray, but if you set this from infinite sphere to finite sphere, Daz Studio will give you the option to change the size of this whole sphere if you wanted to do that. And the other option is the finite box. That is essentially like the cube that I've shown you in Unreal Engine. If you had a smaller environment that wouldn't look good if you project the HDRI onto a sphere, then you can use the finite box. And all these options are also available with ground, with or without ground. Doesn't seem to make much of a difference in my experiments. Just know that the option is there and see what you can experiment with. When I showed you in Unreal Engine how I can change the up and down, so the y-axis in Daz Studio, that can also be set in Iray here. That's under ground. That is here, the ground position mode. That's by default set to auto. And Daz Studio, or Iray rather, does a fairly good job at picking out where the ground plane needs to be. If you ever needed to change that, you can switch this over to manual, and then you have these options active that you can change the ground origin X, Y, and Z with. Just know it's there. Auto usually works very well. Was there anything else that we needed to talk about? Oh, yes. Dome rotation. Let's talk about that. Sometimes, so if I had something that isn't a sphere and it's something that I'd like to look at maybe from the front like this. Imagine I wanted to look at my object from this position, but I'd like my shadow to point to the left, just for example. Or I wanted to change whatever I see in the background. Maybe the tree isn't what I want to see. Maybe I want to see something else. Then I can change the whole rotation of the dome. In fact, in all 3 axes. But the one that makes most sense to us is the Y rotation. So rotating the dome that way. You can rotate it this way and that way as well. But the Y rotation can happen once again here under render settings. Under dome, we have these options here. Yes, we can see them all. Dome orientation, X, Y, and Z. And we have another one, which is the dome rotation. That goes from 0 to 360. That is actually equivalent to this. So if I wanted to watch what happens to my HDRI here in the background, if Iray can keep up, if I go on to the left here, yeah, it's difficult to see in Iray. Let me go and show you this in Filament just as a preview here, because it just reacts much faster. So if I go and move this, then I can literally see that I can dial in whatever I'd like to see. Perhaps I'm interested in putting my object into something like this here, into that position. Then I can do that. So that's the Y rotation of the dome. That turns the HDRI around. And as such, it will also change the direction of the shadows. So I'm going to see that my shadows are now coming exactly like the ones from the tree. So they're going to go to the back here. I'll switch Iray back on in a minute. Just to show you the other things here. X rotation is of course this, so that's like banking your HDRI. That's also kind of cool that you can do that. And then you can do the same in Z, and that is, you know, kind of crazy depending on where you're looking at it from. And then dome rotation, just to show you this, dome rotation will do the same thing, but it won't let you go left of here, you'd have to go and kind of think outside the box and then you know, move this. So I kind of prefer to use the dome Y rotation, but you can use dome rotation or dome orientation Y. It doesn't really matter. Let me just go set this up like so, and then I'll go switch it back to Iray so that we can see the effect. One last thing perhaps, if you have a look at this parameter here while Iray is thinking about it, there is the environment lighting resolution. So the default is set to 512, and that means how detailed my sky dome will bounce light back from the inside into the center of the scene. 512 is good, but if you wanted to make that more accurate, if you wanted to try that out, rendering will take a little bit longer. If you set this to something like 5000, then you have 10 times the amount of lighting resolutions. Think about it as the geometry on the dome, and every single polygon that's facing to the inside will send light as if it's like a tiny little mini mesh light. And if you make that more detailed, you have more tiny little mesh lights that send rays into the center of the scene. That's what this does. And often when you bring in HDRI lighting products, and they will come up with a higher lighting resolution like this. If you ever have products that are based on HDRIs, you will be able to find them in things like in the Smart Content tab, for example. They're going to be under either render settings or they're going to be under lights. It kind of depends. They're going to be dotted all over the place. Render settings basically saves everything that is on the render settings tab, and as such it will also save the environment map with it. That's why some of them are found there. Lights, some of them are also found under lights. Kind of depends how the smart content is set up. And then in the content library, you'll know how to get there. It'll load the HDRI in, it'll load you the render settings in, and they're basically one-click products here. Let me show you this one here from Cake One, the click and render HDRIs. They're very nice. They come with these little previews here, and they make more sense for characters, and we'll talk more about those when we talk about characters. But if I go and double click maybe this one here, takes a second, then you'll see that the background completely changes, and we'll also see that under render settings, my HDRI has changed. And this is what her HDRI looks like with render settings applied. And you can see Cake One has actually increased this to 4000 so that we have more lighting resolution there. But the principle is the same. This now has this little spiral visible at the top here. If I go and move that around, maybe, so this goes in increments. If you wanted to move that by exactly 90 degrees, that's how that would work, or 180, that would turn it around completely. Kind of depends what you need this for. So it works with those products as well. If you had a HDRI that you bring in yourself and set up yourself from something like Polyhaven here, if we had brought this in and I wanted to save this as part of my own render settings to be reused in something else, you can do that as well. I'm back here under my personal library that I've made there last time. Maybe I'm going to go and make myself a new folder here, create subfolder, and call that Light Presets. Then I can go and click this plus icon here and choose Render Settings Preset. And that will go and save my HDRI with the settings that I've created there. It'll actually save all the render settings, including my render dimensions and my render samples and anything and everything related to rendering that we're going to talk about later in this course. That is really all I can tell you about HDRIs at this point. We're going to come back to this topic as we build our render and as we start lighting our scenes, one with a HDRI, one just with scene lights. And scene lights is in fact the next thing that we're going to talk about, the parametric lights that I've hinted at in the beginning. That'll be our next topic.